Welcome. I gave you a handout tonight because it summarizes many of the things that we went over the first time. For those who weren't here the first night, I just went over the background of the Bible, how it got put together, what's in it, why the things are in there that are, the criteria for getting it in there, who decided to put it in, and a little bit about the difference between Jewish, Protestant, Catholic Bibles, and all the books and so on. So, I'll just go through these pretty quickly, and then we'll get to what we're doing tonight. But Hebrew Scriptures and Old Testament, some people use those phrases synonymously, but really they aren't. Hebrew Scriptures literally means, Hebrew is a language, first of all, so it would just be the ones that are written in Hebrew. It would not include the ones that are written in Greek. And it's also the Hebrew Scriptures, the ones that the Jews have only, so that would not include the other 7. So if you say Old Testament, you're also including the 7 books that we have in our Bible. It would be all 46. If you were saying really Hebrew Scriptures, you would only be talking about 39. BC and BCE, you all know before Christ probably. BCE is what they use today to include everybody. They call it before the Common Era. So they just say we all start with the year 1 together, so that way everybody in the world is on the same year, regardless of what your religious beliefs are. AD, by the way, does not mean after the death of Jesus. If that were true, you'd be missing 30 years in between. So AD means Anno Domini, or year of the Lord, so that would be the year 1. Yeah, I told you last week the Protestant, Hebrew, and Christian Catholic Bibles, so the Hebrew Bible, Jewish Bible, would have those 39 books of the Old Testament. Protestant Bible would have those 39 books plus the 27 of the New Testament, and Catholics would have 46 of the Old Testament plus the 27 of the New. Catholics and Protestants have the same New Testament. The Catholics have 7 books in the Old Testament, in addition to what Protestants have. Protestants have the same 39 as the Jews. The Torah is the first 5 books. Torah is the Hebrew word for law or instruction, because that's where those 613 laws are that I mention every now and then in homilies in church. The historical section is based on historical events, but told from a certain point of view, especially a theological point of view. There's no such thing back then as history like we have it today, where people are worried about getting the exact details and dates and stuff down. They didn't worry about that. They interpreted what happened and gave their views that way. The prophetic books are based on the words and the experiences of people called prophets that we do much later. And I mentioned that there are 7 wisdom books. All the other books of the Bible are about the country of Israel, the nation of Israel. The 7 wisdom books are not about the nation of Israel. They're more about us as individuals, the plight that us as individuals face here on earth. There are a few books which I call story books, which are not listed as story books in the Bible. They're within other sections. But when we get to them, I'll explain why I call them, because they are didactic, which means for the purpose of teaching. And some of your Bibles, if you look at your table of contents, some might have the Torah, the first 5, and maybe they'll just have historical, beginning with Joshua and going all the way to the end of Ezra and Nehemiah. Others might call the first few former prophets. Jewish people call the first few books like Joshua, Judges, and the ones after that the former prophets. Most Catholics just include those within that historical section. Former simply means earlier, latter means later. So the deuterocanonical, deutero means second. So the deuterocanonical books is like the second canon. It's misnamed possibly, but I mean, deuterocanonical means the 7 books that are in the Catholic Bible that are not in the Protestant Bible. And then I mentioned there which ones they are. I mentioned that canon means the official list of books in the Bible, and we kind of had a general list already by the early 100s. But by the end of the 4th century, they had it pretty well set. They finalized it after the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s and said it's these and only these. And that's when And then the Protestant churches began, they kept the same New Testament as us, but chose the Jewish Old Testament. If you ever see the word Septuagint, S-E-P-T means 7, so it's 70. The story that 70 scholars got together and translated the Bible into Greek, which was the language of that time. So the Septuagint refers 70 in general. You count all, there's 73, but however you count. I told you about the criteria for putting books in the Old Testament, so they're listed there. Everybody assumed the first 5 were valid, so it couldn't contradict anything in the first 5 books. Had to be written by around 400 BC. Ezra was probably before that, and it had to be written in Hebrew and in Palestine, or the Holy Land. Some of those 7 were written in Greek and in Egypt or other places, which is why they weren't included in some. And then I give examples of that there. How the Bible came into its current form. Okay, and you can just look through that. People experienced God, told those stories orally for a long, long time. Remember, most people didn't write, didn't read. So you had to tell the stories over and over orally. Eventually, people did start writing them down when they knew how to do that, but they also interpreted what they had heard and put a meaning behind it. And then after that, when it was copied and so on, it was edited to current theology of the times. And then later on, Jewish rabbis decided which books were part of the Hebrew canon, or Bible. The word Bible simply means books. If you ever heard of fundamentalists or contextualists, that's the 2 ways of interpreting the Bible. If you ever hear of a fundamentalist, that means they take it as it says it. So what it says is what happened, what it says is what it means. You don't need anybody to explain it to you. Even if it seems unbelievable, it happened, because God could do that. And then a contextualist would be someone who explains the meaning based on the context of it. So, for example, if you were in church, I gave the context of weddings of the time of Jesus, how they were done. Hopefully that helped you understand that passage. But if I hadn't done that, you might have wondered, well, gee, how come people are coming to weddings at different times, or how come they have to wait so long? All right, so you explain the context of the time. So that's what it is when you take the Bible in context. And anytime somebody asks me to comment on a scripture passage or to give a homily on it, I ask myself 2 questions. Okay, first of all, when was it written? Okay, so I know the history, so as soon as I know the year something was written, I know what's going on. If you know American history, you could do the same about a novel and when it's written. The date it was written tells you a lot about why it was written and what it means. And then the other thing is you see what is the form it was written. All right, a lot of people struggle with the Bible because there's different literary forms in it. And it shouldn't be that difficult, because if I were to tell you to go down to the library and get a bunch of different books, would you read all the books the same? And hopefully you would say, well, no, of course not. Do you read a poem the same way as you would read history? No. So in the Bible, there's a lot of poetry. In the Bible, there are songs. In the Bible, there are novels. In the Bible, there are short stories. In the Bible, there is some biography and there's some history. So all of the above. The only problem is it doesn't say at the beginning of the book, this is poetry, or this is a narrative, or this is whatever. You have to figure that out. If you go down to the library, they've got sections, right? Fiction, nonfiction, biography, all that. Okay, the Bible isn't that way. You figure it out if you understand it well enough. So, if I know the form it was written in and when it was written, I can usually figure it out pretty easy what it means for us. All right, a fundamentalist, some of the fundamentalist people you see on TV, don't worry about that. They just say this is what happened. All right, and I mentioned the word, if I said what translation do you have, that means what version. Translation or version, same thing. The New American Bible is the one used in church. There's the King James Version, named after King James, who ordered scholars to translate it into English back a little after 1600. Some are very literal, meaning they're translated exactly what the words mean. That would be appropriate for scholars. They would understand exactly what it meant. But for other people, you translate it looser, which means you convey the meaning of a word. And if it doesn't translate perfectly into English, you convey it in a way that makes sense for us. Okay, in the same way that if you were taking Spanish and the Spanish teacher says, translate this page from English into Spanish or vice versa, you wouldn't all do it the same, but you might still get it correct because there's more than one way of translating a certain, as long as you don't change the meaning. And I list some examples there. Okay, the big thing, remember there was no Bible that people could read until after Gutenberg invented the printing press, because then you could copy it and everybody could have one. Before that, the only way you could have one would be if a monk came and spent his life taking this book and copying it. So after the printing press, you could run it off. And then in the Protestant Reformation, the Protestant reformers said the Bible is all you need, whereas Catholics say, well, yeah, Bible, but we also use tradition, which is, tradition basically relates the Bible to our time. That was one of the differences among the reformers and the Catholics. Catholic Bible study really started after Pope Pius XII wrote a document which I mentioned there, which said there are different literary forms in the Bible, so it is helpful to know those. And then Vatican Council II encouraged Bible study, and I mentioned that's one of the purpose for Bibles. One is for use in liturgy, one is for private reading, and one is for studying together. All right, and then I gave a little bit of the next section there about different literary forms again. Do you ever hear these phrases, textual criticism, source criticism, form criticism, rhetorical criticism, third page there? Criticism isn't the best word, really. It means analysis. So if I do source criticism, I'm analyzing the sources that were used in a particular book. So analysis would probably be a better word. Form criticism, what literary form was used. Textual criticism, what's the exact word? Okay? And then there's some reasons for studying the Old Testament. They make sense. Last week, for G there, I showed you some of those, the other things that are available for you to use in understanding the Bible better. Then some main names that I use there. Some of the background of what I did last week and this week. And when it says week 1, week 2, that was for a college class that I taught. So we did 5 nights, 4 hours a night. So. So that's a quick review of last week. Any questions on that? So now you've got some things to read to refresh your memory with that. All right, so tonight I kind of said I'd go over the Torah last time, but then in the last Sundays I said I'm going to do primarily the book of Deuteronomy tonight. And the reason for that is the author of the book of Deuteronomy and the next several books, we're going to do the kind of like the history of the nation of Israel, from Moses until the collapse of the kingdom. So if you want to do the historical parts first, you could start with Joshua, but I'm going to start with Deuteronomy because that way I can include some of these things about the first 5 books. Most people, when they study the Old Testament, start with Genesis, which I think is a mistake. You know, a lot of study, they spend so much time on that. I think it makes more sense to do these other books first, and then those earlier books make more sense after you understand what had happened to the people from the beginning to the end. When I was in seminary, Old Testament, that the instructors started with Joshua. which is the immediate book right after Deuteronomy, because then you can see what happened to the people when they were in the Promised Land. Okay, and again, history, not like today's history, but based on events that happened, interpreted by writers, edited by later writers before it reaches its final form, and told orally for a long time before anybody started to write it. So, again, the 5 books that I put down what they are. Who wrote the Bible? Well, lots of people. If you talk about the Torah, the first 5 books, scholars generally say you can tell that there's 4 different authors. And the best way I can explain that is when I was a teacher, I knew when somebody plagiarized on a paper. All right, if somebody who wasn't the brightest student reads something that looks like a college student wrote it, college student probably did write it, and the student copied. Okay? And now it's easy to find because you can catch that so easy on the computer. But anyway, when people analyze the writing styles of those first 5 books, they say, yeah, we can tell definitely 4 different strands of writing here. So I mentioned those there where it says information about the writers. Often they're called Y, E, D, and P. Y stands for the Yahwist. Why? Because God's referred to as 2 different names in the first few books. So we say, all right, why would God have 2 different names? Well, it's because one writer refers to God as Yahweh, and this other writer refers to God as Elohim. And then in time, they just all settled on Yahweh. So whenever the God is referred to as Yahweh, we call that writer the Yahwist. And whenever there's a section with God referred to as Elohim, we refer to that reading as the E writer or the Elohist writer. The priestly writer, probably from Leviticus, because we've got so many rules for priests. And then the one that we'll talk more about tonight is the D one, the Deuteronomist, because the book of Deuteronomy and the following books is probably from that particular writer. Some people say it wasn't written until during the Babylonian exile, which would be in the middle of the 500s BC. But when I wrote this, it said maybe about 720 BC. So remember, the more recent numbers get lower, right? Okay, so because like Deuteronomy, we're going to be like the 1200s BC, and by the time we get to the end of the history books, we're 500 BC or even closer to 100 BC, depending upon how far you go. So that's the 4 strands of writing in the first 5 books. And then I give a little summary of what each of those books is about there, a summary of the first 5 books, and then I list some vocabulary there. So the ones that I haven't talked about will come later. So, and then the characters. So when the Jewish people do their history, they go way back, all right, they say Abraham is the founder of our faith. Abraham and Sarah. And then they had their son, Isaac, who married Rebekah. And then they had the child, Jacob. And then Jacob had several women that he had children with to the tune of 12 boys. And those 12 boys are the 12 tribes of Israel, because Jacob's name is changed to Israel. So Jacob's 12 sons are the 12 tribes of Israel. So you go from one family to 1 to 12, and then the nation of Israel is the descendants of those 12 tribes. But there's a big gap then, because by the time Jacob dies, it just says they became slaves in Egypt then after that, and we pick up the story several centuries later with Moses. And we don't really know much about the time in between. We just don't. There isn't much written history about that. It talks about different peoples that lived in Egypt. You can study Egyptian history, and the Jews would be mentioned in there. But eventually, there was a time where a decent number of them left. And they left under the leadership of a man named Moses. And that is what is talked about in the book of, in Exodus, and then repeated through the words of Moses in Deuteronomy. So remember, Deutero means second. So Deuteronomy is like second law, second telling of the law. So if you're familiar with Exodus, Deuteronomy will make sense, because you're going to say, yep, I read that in Exodus. All right, so for the rest of tonight, I'm probably going to sit here and hopefully stay on screen, and we'll go through what happens in Deuteronomy. But before I do that, any questions on anything on this handout? Or anything that I've said?
What year was the Gutenberg Bible? You mentioned that they started printing Bibles.
Yeah, probably the middle of the 15th century. I could probably find out the exact year. I put down 1453, but that's the year Constantinople fell, so I might have put that year down instead. It might have been a little bit later. But it was around that time, because it was done so that at the time of Martin Luther, they said, let's do that, let's use it. So yeah, printing press was a huge invention. It really changed human history. You could write things down immediately rather than having it translated and copied and so on for so long. All right, so the book of Deuteronomy is similar to Exodus. It doesn't tell all the stories, though, but it refers to them, and you might say, okay, yeah, I remember a story like that back in Exodus. And if you remember those little letters, for those who weren't here the first time, when you go through reading the actual Bible itself, sometimes, so first of all, didn't originally have chapters and verses. Those were put in later to make it easier to read. So that little number is the verse of that particular chapter. And every now and then, you might see a small letter after a passage. And remember what that means? Something about that passage was in an earlier book, and you can look it up. So it might say Exodus 23 or whatever, and you can go back and look at that passage. It refers it. And the same thing in the New Testament. When Jesus tells the parable of the sower and the seed, there'll be a little letter there, and you might look it up, and they'll say where it is in Matthew, where it is in Mark, where it is in Luke. Okay, so sometimes there'll be a lot of references in Deuteronomy back to something that was in Exodus or one of the other books. So Deuteronomy begins with, these are the words which Moses spoke to all of Israel. Okay, so Moses spoke them a long time ago, though. So these aren't probably going to be his exact words. But for the audience, this is what you need to know, because in the opinion of the people who put it together, this is what we believe about Moses and what we believe about God and what we believe about us. And the book is pretty much got three main sections to it. So we start off with this little historical review. And it says that the Jews were in the desert about 40 years. So you're probably familiar with that. When was those 40 years? In seminary, we were told it was somewhere maybe 1260 to 1220 BC, somewhere around there. There are some scholars that go back into the 1400s BC, so it would be considerably earlier. Doesn't matter too much, but it's about the time we get to about 1000 BC that we're much more accurate on dates. After the time of David, we're pretty accurate because they write about historical people that there's records of from other places, and we know that pretty clear. Once we get to that time, we can know that. But here we're time pieced together, and it said that 40 years, and then it even says this here in the first chapter, verse 3, in the 40th year. Moses says this, all right, it's time to go. Desert's not the easiest place to stay, but why did they stay at Mount Sinai? By the way, Sinai and Horeb are the same place. Jews use the word Sinai. Arabs today call it Horeb. I remember when Jimmy Carter was president, Egypt and Israel signed a peace treaty. But anyway, you know how that is. Boy, how many back and forth before it's suitable to everybody. But they said the last compromise they made was they referred to that place. So it said Sinai and then parentheses Horeb. So that way both sides could be happy with what it was called. One reason they stayed there, because I was there for a couple days back when I was a student in seminary. We spent a semester in Israel, and we went through Egypt. It was dusty. That was the bad part where we slept. But the water was good.
Really?
And that's probably why they stayed there. There's still today a good supply of water around Mount Sinai. So we filled up all of our containers to last us, because we were going to go through some places where there wasn't much water for a couple of days. So that would be a reason for why they stayed in that particular spot for a while. If you ever see a map of what people think was the trip from Egypt to the Promised Land, like here's Egypt, here's the Promised Land, and here's how they go. All right, well, there's two reasons for that. Most of the land in between is desert. Okay, so you can't take that because you'll die. And every now and then they zigzag where there's people that they don't want to fight. So they zigzag around their land. So that's why the route's not a straight one. So they depart from the mountain. So I'll just kind of go with what these headings are. Again, the headings aren't part of the original Bible, but they're there to help you to understand it faster. I'm obviously not going to analyze all this, but hopefully by going through it, it makes the story make a little more sense. It says the 12 scouts. And if you look, there's an endnote in there somewhere where if you look back, it'll talk about where it was in the book of Numbers. One of the notes there will make a reference to Numbers. Anyway, back during the time that they were on their way, Moses says, I'm going to get one man from each of the 12 tribes, and you go look at this land that we're going to go to, and you come back and give me a report. So they do that, but the story says that when they came back, 10 of the 12 say, I don't think we can go in there. There's too many people, and they're like giants, and it's going to be very troublesome. And two of them, Joshua and Caleb, who I mentioned in your handout, they say, no, we can go. It'll work. So anyway, they're rewarded for their faith, that they believe they'll be able to go there. And then it does say at the end that Joshua and Caleb are the only two that were part of the original Exodus that are still alive 40 years later when they make it into the Promised Land. Everybody else, it's the next generation. So anyway, it's a review of what happened when they did that. All the way along, there are threats of revolt. You remember that probably from some Sunday readings where the people complain against Moses. They complain they're out of food, they complain they're out of water. They say, yeah, if we'd have been in Egypt, we'd at least had enough to eat, and we just died of natural causes. Here we're going to starve or whatever, or here we're going to get killed by other people. So that's regular. It talks about one time they had a failed invasion. They lost a battle to the Amorites. So all these other peoples are named in here. They go northward along Edom. Edom is the land immediately south of the Promised Land. So when you get to Edom and Moab, you're getting very close. And those are the places mentioned in chapter 2. Maybe the oldest part of the Bible is a song. It's in one of the Psalms, but it's also here, that the Jews sang after victories over Sihon and Og. Sihon is, they call him a king, but back then king might be the leader of like a town. So anyway, they defeat this area where Sihon is the king, and then they defeat this little area where Og is the king as they're on their way to the Promised Land, and they take that as a sign that God is with them and will protect them and will make them successful as they go to the Promised Land. The revelation at Horeb in the middle of chapter 4. Moses talks about how I did go up the mountain. I did hear God. God told me these things. Many times it mentions the statutes and decrees of the Lord. So Moses was told these things by God, and then he tells them to the people. Danger of idolatry. Remember, you're not supposed to have idols, which is the second part of the first commandment. People were always tempted to make an idol of God. Didn't mean really that you worship that idol, but we believe God can't be pictured, right? I mean, no picture can encompass something that's all powerful, right? So you shouldn't do that. The sin of the Jews, which is mentioned later, you all know the golden calf story. No, the sin isn't, they're not worshiping this bull. They want to worship God, but they want God to at least look like something that they can recognize. So they did an image of a bull, but they are told, no, don't do any images. It's impossible to picture God. And remember, Muslims are that way. That's why when they go to places, they'll destroy churches or Buddhist temples. And why? Because they say there's idols there. You know, if you're making a stone image of somebody, you're making an idol of him. So, you're not supposed to do that. Get rid of that.
What was the size of this group of people that?
Nobody knows.
Okay.
There are, in the book of Numbers, it says they count them, which is why it's called the book of Numbers, and it's got them tens of thousands, but there's no way this land could have supported that many people. So we don't know. The numbers that are given there are probably the numbers that existed centuries later when the book was written. So perfect answer is we don't know. Second answer would be different scholars give different answers. You can get a general answer, but nobody knows for sure. Now, you know that I've mentioned many times that there are 613 commandments in the Bible, right? In those first 5 books. There are times when they do mention the 10. So that's in chapter 5, where it says the covenant at Horeb. So this is the one author refers to the mountain as Sinai. The other one refers to it as Horeb. But anyway, while they're on this mountain, they receive the covenant. What is a covenant? It's a binding agreement. So in our church today, we have, when we talk about covenant, we often are talking about marriage. Marriage is a binding covenant. It's a legal one, but it's more than that, including promises or vows that are made to one another. That one doesn't have a picture. Is it still okay?
It's still on, so.
Okay. All right, good.
All right.
All right, so we're not going to do all 613 here quickly, but we're going to do the Decalogue. Deca means 10, so the 10 laws, 10 commandments. So if you ever want to know 2 places in the Bible where the 10 commandments are, one is in Exodus, and it'll probably, if you look at your little letter there, it'll tell you where it is. That little S probably tells you that's where it is in the book of Exodus. But there's your 10 commandments in chapter 5 of Deuteronomy. And then Moses goes on and talks about how he received those and how important they are for all of us to follow. So he says these are the commandments. And there's a little bit more than 10 mentioned there. And as I say, there's many more in other places. Beginning in chapter 6, he says these are the commandments and statutes. Keep them. But then in chapter 6, verse 4, it says the great commandment. Because remember when Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? Did he give any of the 10? No, he gave one from another place. But the great one here is chapter 6,